Rick? Oh, there we go. All right, very good. All right, good evening, everybody. We will now call to order the regular meeting of the Port of West Sacramento for July 19th, 2023. And we will lead off with our pledge. Commissioner Dante Early, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we'll note for the record, all commissioners are present. That takes us to item 1, which is presentations by public on matters that are not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have any slips to speak?
There are no public
We have
requests.
no slips to speak and no one stepping forward, so we'll assume that that will be the case. Consent agenda, we have 2 items on consent. Are there any questions or comments? Or Rick, do you have anything to add to the consent agenda?
No.
Move to approve.
All right, so we have a motion to approve by Commissioner Guerrero
Early seconds.
and with an early second. Madam Clerk?
Commissioner Orozco,
Aye.
Commissioner Early, Commissioner Sulpicio-Ho,
Aye.
Commissioner Guerrero,
Aye.
Sheriff Villegas,
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Very good. Okay. With that, item 4 is consideration adoption of Resolution P23-1 approving the port budget for fiscal year 23-24.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
if I could just do a quick intro to this item, I just wanted to start by thanking Rick for preparing the budget. You obviously have been there since the start when we went into the new business model, and the current budget format is very familiar to you because it's been sort of the same format. What's been really good, though, is to see in the last few years, the port has had really good years, and I really give Rick a lot of credit for that, and he's going to give the presentation tonight and walk through it. I also want to take the opportunity in case the members of the Port Commission and the council members that are here haven't met Ted. Ted Williams is fairly newish to our finance department, I think a little less than a year, but Ted's presence tonight is an assumption that Ted had been working with Rick on the budget, so thanks for being here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So, yeah, Ted keeps me honest, so he did in fact review the numbers. So, and that's, part of the efficiency of the way we operate the port is having the city resources at our disposal, and that includes finance department. So, I wanted to start tonight, kind of given that this is this new commission's first budget. And we've just completed 10 years with our landlord operating model. So we have a 10-year record now of this landlord operating model. And so I want to just kind of talk through this a little bit. This is actually a pretty picture. It shows kind of the stability and the sustainability of the landlord model. The green is slowly rising, which is a great thing. The yellow, our expense side, is stable. And our net, the black bars are, for the last 6 years, they've been in the $1.5 million range. And so this structure is 100% correlated to the landlord operating model. So 10 years ago, we executed the terminal lease with SSA. And in so doing, we basically handed to them much of the port's maritime revenue. We also handed to them the expenses related to running the port. And so prior to that model, we were consistently running operating deficits of $1 million to $1.5 million. Switching to a landlord allowed us to downsize basically to run the port with one staff person, with city support, of course. And that has generated consistent revenues with a little growth, and it really stabilized our expenses. So you'll see We've been in the $3 million range. This year, we outperformed that, but generally about $3 million in operating revenue and about 1.5 in operating expenses, plus debt service of about 200, so about 1.7 in consistent annual operating expenses. So we've completed 10 years. We just executed the extension with SSA, so I would expect this chart to kind of, continue on as you see it here. So taking a look at, we'll start by looking at the year just passed, fiscal year 23. And it was, in fact, our best operating performance in that 10-year period. Revenues are up to $3.5 million, well above budget, and largely due to increased wharfage and rail fees. And those are variable fees, which we're very conservative when we budget. And so, and you'll see that when I go through the proposed budget for this coming year, I've really knocked those down. So we had an outstanding year. Expenses came in right on budget, and leaving us with an operating profit of $1.8 million and $7.6 million in cash reserves. That includes, when I talk about operating income, that doesn't include one-time revenues. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the $7.6 million includes one-time revenues that are somewhat unpredictable. But we had a good year for one time too. Okay, this gives you a flavor of where our revenues are coming from. 60+% on the maritime side. That includes 4 main leases: SSA, Cemex, Yara, and Two Rivers Cement. 23% on non-maritime lease revenues, and 13% rail. On the expense side, personnel and insurance are our two highest categories, followed by debt service, and then you can see the breakdown of the smaller categories. So some qualitative highlights from this past year: we executed the SSA lease amendment and extension. We completed an EV charging project out in the North Terminal. We initiated, or I should say we completed, a pilot project for our groundwater cleanup.
Plug it.
We good?
Go ahead, Rick, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Not quite sure.
And we executed the Seaway option agreement. I can pause.
I chew my nails, I wouldn't have been able to get my nail in there. Thank you. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
All right. Oh, all right. So just highlighting some qualitative, accomplishments or milestones for the last year. These all do have budget implications. I was talking about the groundwater pilot project. That's an ongoing issue and an expense that we're going to have to deal with. We executed the Seaway option agreement, which ultimately will generate revenues to both the port and the city. And finally, we applied for the second time for the Enterprise Crossing. We didn't get that grant, and that has some budget implications too, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So on the cargo side, I think you all know we handled 2 primary cargoes, rice and cement. Our volumes were down a little bit this year, but still healthy. In in a longer-term, context, it was still a very healthy year for our cargo volumes, but down about 12% from the previous year. And on the capital side, this is a summary of how we spent our for projects, one-time projects. The commission actually approved $900,000 in a capital budget. We only spent $420,000. And that first category, North Terminal projects, I think you're going to see a fairly consistent amount from year to year that staff will recommend. The port's 60 years old. Our infrastructure is old. Some of our original buildings are our primary cargo handling facility. So we typically have, unexpected, or unanticipated repairs that come up. So we budget for that. We applied for the raise grant, as I said, and we did contribute $100,000 to the Stone Lock property, which was in dire need of cleanup. And going forward, we added this to our operating budget at $25,000 a year. So this was just a lump sum contribution for this year. So that sums up this last year just ended. This is your proposed budget highlighted. The green column is the proposed budget summary for this coming fiscal year. The detail on this is attached to the budget resolution. But we are, as I mentioned, we're conservative on our revenue projections. So you'll see a significant downshift in the operating revenue, fairly consistent on the expense side. But the big ask tonight is the capital budget, which I'll get to in just a moment. So we are actually proposing after one-time expenses, a deficit, if you will, for the year. Yeah, I just went through all of this. At the end of the year, if we spent that entire capital budget, we'd still have $6.8 million in the bank. One thing I do want to highlight on that, $3 million of our reserves are encumbered for a future property acquisition, the shale tank farm. I expect that will occur in about 2 years. They're just they've demoed the improvements. They've got a cleanup plan in place, and you'll start to see some soil excavation occurring later this year. But just keep in mind when we're looking at our cash reserves, $3 million of that is committed.
Hang on, Rick, we have a question.
Rick, just a quick question on that. Is that already a set price, or is that just encumbered, but there's no bid, offer, whatever transaction?
Set price. We have a binding agreement for $3 million.
Okay.
So this is the big ask, the capital program for this coming year. The first bullet there is routine stuff that I already talked about. The $1 million modernization reserve is a reserve. It's not you're not approving a $1 million project tonight. It's really a set aside meant to be available to contribute to North Terminal investments that would likely be leveraged by grant funding and contributions from SSA. So if you recall in our lease amendment with SSA, there's a provision in there which requires them to do a terminal investment plan. They're in the process of doing that. That plan will identify investments in the terminal that, in their opinion, will generate a return on that investment. That plan will be presented to the commission. You'll have full opportunity to review that and approve any expenditures related to that. But this is really just a set aside, so it's a paper expense, if you will. And then finally, the Enterprise Crossing project, we didn't get the raised grant. We tried twice. So the port and the city, through the council retreat, if you may recall, we agreed to this 1/3, 2/3 split, where the port would contribute to this initial study 1/3 of the cost, and the city would contribute 2/3. So we think that's a city project, but my understanding is it's anticipated to be approximately $3.6 million contract. It's a 3-year time period to complete that. So we're asking you tonight to contribute $400,000 that effectively is conditional. At some point in the months ahead, city staff will be approaching the council with a request for $800,000 to fund year 1 of that study. So you can look at this as a 3-year commitment of $400,000 per year as the port's contribution to the Enterprise Crossing study. So with that, I will conclude. That is it. And turn it to the commission for any questions.
All
Thank
right,
you.
very good. Well, thank you, Rick, for the presentation, and thank you for the work. Mr. Washington, nice to meet you as well. Very good. Any questions? Or Williams, I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. Any comments or questions by members of the commission? Commissioner Guerrero.
Yes, quick question about dredging. Did we receive a grant for dredging, and if so, where is it, like, who is tracking that to the expenditure of the port?
No, maintenance dredging happens every year through federal appropriations.
Right.
And those monies are handled directly by the Corps of Engineers, and their contractor. The only, it was 2010-11 timeframe, the port had received an allocation Prop B money for the channel deepening project of $9.7 million. That money was, when that project was effectively dead, those monies were diverted to the McGowan Bridge project. But that we don't apply for, nor do we receive grant funding for maintenance dredging.
But we do, it is part of the city and port's ongoing federal advocacy campaign, so we ensure that, it's at the top of the list near the top of the list among the other asks, so that we continually get the appropriation for the Corps to continue to keep the channel at its current depth.
Okay.
So that's all, but it's all handled by the Corps. They do all the contracting for it. All the work is done, aside from the port.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, most recently, the appropriations have been much more generous than in the past. We've been in the $4 to $6 million range for the last 3 years or so, which is frankly more money than we can spend. We have a 3-month window to do maintenance dredging because of species concerns, so we're in the window. It actually starts in August. August, September, October is a 3-month window where that maintenance dredging occurs every year.
Thank you. And the $1 million in North Terminal Modernization Reserve, what are we looking to establish there?
It's just a set aside to be available for potential North Terminal improvements. So the terminal's in need of modernization. It's the SSA lease is for 80 acres. They're using about half of that, 40 acres, for active cargo operations. What I call the back area, it's also, you could think of it as the north side of the terminal, is unutilized, and the cargo handling facilities in those areas are effectively obsolete. So the modernization concept, which we're asking SSA to develop, would look at, replacing those facilities with forward-looking cargo-related facilities.
Yeah, but the last or the last commission meeting we had, there was some public testimony, and understandably so, the budget's difficult to read, it's hard to understand, certainly from a layman's perspective. There was some questions around setting aside funds for maintenance and infrastructure needs going forward because the port is deteriorating. And so we specifically directed Rick to come back with a budget that identified where those funds were so that it was visible to the naked eye that we do have funds and they're set aside. They're just not clearly visible all the time, but they need to be leveraged as well. Not a lot, but it's a little bit to start. Right. Any other? So Commissioner Orozco first, and then.
Thank you, Rick, for the presentation. I appreciate the revenue projections staying conservative. I know that has been the trend. Two questions. The first is probably a softball, but I saw the soil and groundwater cleanup as well as stone lot cleanup. I'm wondering, is the cleanup a result of the operations of the port, or is this something that just as a result of being in the middle of our city, folks are littering, or what is it that we're doing there?
Yeah, it's definitely past port operations, specifically fertilizer handling. So we have nitrates in the soil and groundwater in the areas where the fertilizer was stored in the past.
The Stone Lock property, however, is a little different. So the port historically had owned Stone Lock. We own property around the Stone Lock facility, so it's kind of shared ownership with the city. And I think the council, those of you that are council members, and then certainly the chair, are familiar with that location, knowing that we've had some challenges there with vandalism and people breaking in. So we're working with the city as the port to better secure that facility. And when we say cleanup, it's like physical cleanup of debris and things like that, so that it can be kind of secured. And then in the meantime, the city working on a plan through its parks master plan to turn it into a recreational facility. So the port will obviously benefit from that, owning property around it. So that's why we're contributing funding to helping it stay clean.
Okay, but the one that Rick was just mentioning is more of a remedial effort for past bills.
Right.
Do we consider this a long-term investment over?
Yeah, it's definitely a long-term investment. We've actually been we have a stormwater pond system in place that was built specifically to prevent fertilizer runoff, and we've converted that system over the years to actually pump groundwater, contaminated groundwater into that pond system. We've been doing that for 20 years. And so this pilot project is an attempt to expedite that remediation because there's really no end date. It's just we've been doing it for 20 years, so we're trying to speed that up by getting creative. Basically now that we've done the pilot, we plan to excavate about a 3-acre plot and actually plant vegetation there to help take up the contaminants. So more to come on that. That'll be a supplemental budget appropriation down the road that I'll bring back to the commission.
Thank you. I also noticed that there was a significant, or has been a significant investment in insurance costs. Is that, how has the complexion of those investments changed in this budget, if any?
Yeah, so property insurance, the CEO knows this, has been my it's been my mission to reduce those. They've just been on a crazy uphill, trend, and so they're down this year, or this in this proposed budget, because we uninsured some of these facilities that I'm describing that are obsolete. And we wrote that into the SSA lease amendment to give us the right to do that. And in fact, as of July 1, we have some uninsured facilities at the port. And if they were to burn down, we wouldn't replace them. We would demolish them. So,
Just to be clear, though, we did get that approved and conferred with our insurance provider, which the port is part of the YC Parmia insurance pool, same as the city. So I really credit Rick with working with the new director, sort of new director at YC Parmia to justify that we have these old facilities that we're paying for insurance for that haven't been used in some cases decades. And so through that effort, we were able to reduce some of the insurance costs. Meanwhile, insurance costs are continuing to go up in every other way, but at least the number of facilities that we have to pay for insurance has gone down.
Right, Commissioner Sopiso Hall.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the detailed budget and the narrative and the background for my first budget meeting. I appreciate all the extra work you put in for this. My question has to do with capital improvements and if there is an opportunity for us to look at beautification of the front gate and that entryway to the port, and if it was the commission's desire, would that be a supplemental thing that we could chat about coming back, and could it be a partnership with SSA possibly?
I think we would handle that. So the pear trees, I think we had Bradford pear trees on either side of Harbor Boulevard at the port entrance that were damaged in the windstorms. We're replacing those with oak trees as recommended by the city staff, park staff. And so you'll see that happening, but if we want to go above and beyond that, we can certainly embellish that a little bit, and I can work with city staff and getting some numbers together. If it's a significant amount, we'd come back to the commission. Yeah.
It's also possible that it could come under the appropriation if you approve the $1 million of, depending on what type of improvements we're talking about, it could be something that could fall under that. So it's definitely possible.
Thank you.
The sign is vintage, though.
Yes. I was waiting patiently, but
It's historic. Yeah. All right.
You're looking for a motion?
no, I'm looking for questions.
The floor is yours.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I know you guys put in a lot of work on that. I have a couple of questions. Okay, so you highlighted, but I just want to make sure that we're all understanding, and we probably do, that we're on the same page about we're one, and I think you talked about it being a paper deficit, but we would be adopting a strategic plan deficit for this year. And if I'm understanding these numbers right, and I think I do, but you can educate me a little bit, that potentially in the next 2 years, we would continue if we see the projected numbers roundabout in regards to our operating revenues, we may continue to adopt a deficit budget because we would be committing to an additional $400,000 for the next 2 additional years. So one, right?
Yeah, I don't think the 400 for the next 2 years would push us into deficit. It's that $1 million modernization reserve that is creating the paper deficit this year, and that's just a placeholder number. So I don't anticipate coming back to you every year asking for another $1 million for modernization. So I think the way that'll play out is if we identify a project that all parties like and we have an opportunity for grant funding and SSA is willing to participate in that investment, then we would leverage that $1 million. I don't anticipate continual, budget deficit requests. I think it's really related to this modernization reserve, which in my mind right now is a one-time ask.
Rick, could you go back to that slide that shows the operating budget? And while he's doing that, I just want to point out, it really is sort of a term of art when we talk about we're adopting a paper deficit. We absolutely have a net surplus in our operating budget. That's the most important thing.
Can we talk a little bit about
yeah,
that?
our structural expenses are lower than our structural revenue. So we are in a
Yes,
surplus
but
situation. So
Let's keep talking. Just through that
now
just a tiny bit.
What we're doing, we have a one-time fund balance, and there's different ways we could have handled it. We could have said we want to take $1 million out of our existing cash balance and put it towards a capital reserve. In this case, we're actually saying let's put it in the operating budget this year. And a lot of that's because the year shakes out and we tend to do better than we anticipate. So at the end of the year, it may actually not be the same, the same number as you see here. But what's most important is to look at that green column and see the net operating income of 842,000. We are asking you to adopt a budget with a surplus of 842,000 in net operating revenue
So,
before one-time expenditures.
so thank you. Couple more questions, though. So with that in mind, because it sounds like what you're saying is, hey, we're not going to continue to ask you guys to adopt a deficit budget moving forward. And so I do hear that. 6.8, actually, to your point, isn't the number that we're operating in as far as our reserves. It's more like 3.8, right? Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And then potentially what we would be adding is an additional 800,000 to that. I'm not saying that I'm against it. I just want to clearly articulate what we'd be working with. And so then our reserves potentially would be roughly 3 million. Could you go back to the beautiful graph at the top? Thank you. And so I was also just trying to keep up with the expenses, which seemed to hover around the same place. Which was great. Even in the projected and your budgeted, they were roughly around the same, which is pretty amazing, by the way. And but then trying to kind of guess at the revenue, because really how the revenue is building is really based on your we're seeing the operating profit, and that does seem fluctuate a little bit. And so I was just trying to get an idea of how quickly those reserves would fill up, knowing that we are eating into them as well. And so it's just,
Yeah, so,
Could I jump in on that one really quick, Rick? Because this
Please.
chart, what it doesn't include, we've acquired a lot of real estate along the way. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is the operating expenses versus operating revenue. Along the way, some of that profit has gone to things like acquiring properties. We bought multiple properties. We bought Stone Lock back from the city. The Shell deal doesn't show up here yet, but it will. So it's not the whole story looking at this, because part of that profit is going to investments.
okay.
So go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
And so, yeah, when we look at our cash reserves, I like to look at it in terms of a multiple of our operating expenses. And so at $7 million, we're covering about 4 years' worth of expenses. But to your point, if $3 million of that is off the table, that's effectively 2 years of operating.
Right.
If like all of our revenues
still a
ceased,
good margin, by the way.
it's healthy. I don't. And then on the Shell property, so we'd be adding an asset to our balance sheet, right? Not necessarily a liquid asset, but the port's not really in the business of holding property. So there will be some developer interest in that site. It's also the landing of a future Broadway bridge, so the city will need to buy some of that from us. So yeah, it's an asset that can be converted to cash.
Okay. So then just to be clear, it sounds like even with the 3 million, even if we just broke even, right? Not saying that we would, but we're not necessarily projecting out several years, at least on this. What you are imagining, we would still probably continue to add to those reserves, which is why we could comfortably do something like this.
Yes.
Was that a fair articulation?
Yeah, we are conservative because our wharfage and rail fees are variable. We're conservative on budgeting those. I don't like to assume that they're going to be there. If a wicked recession hits, they'll probably go away. But we're not seeing, that kind of, a forecast in the next couple of years. So I think we're very comfortable with these recommendations.
Right. Good. Any other questions? No? So, well, first of all, I guess, in summary, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Aaron, for the work. Pretty straightforward, easy to understand. budget, and so we're looking for a motion to adopt the resolution. All right.
Early moves,
All right, so we have a motion and a second.
early seconds.
All right. Madam Clerk?
Commissioner Orozco?
Aye.
Commissioner Early?
Aye.
Commissioner Zopey-Ziohol?
Aye.
Commissioner Guerrero?
Aye.
Chair Villegas?
Aye. Okay, the motion carried unanimously. Thank you very much. That takes us to item 5, and that's commission reports. Are there any members of the commission with any reports? If not, then that takes us to the Port CEO report.
No report tonight, thank you.
None to be had. Thank you very much. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.